In the autumn of 1854, 37 individuals vanished from the roads leading to Millbrook, Connecticut. Not a single body was ever recovered. Local authorities pointed fingers at wolves, bandits, and even the brutal winter that followed. However, the truth was far more unsettling. For over a century, the town elders had desperately tried to conceal this. Every one of those missing people was last seen heading towards the Hartwell Brothers grist mill on Copper Creek, where the enormous grinding stones churned ceaselessly day and night, even when there was no grain to process. Before we delve deeper into the story of the Hartwell brothers and their ill-fated venture, I have a question for you. Are you listening alone tonight? What you're about to hear might make you appreciate having company. If you're prepared for a tale that will send shivers down your spine, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, let me know in the comments which state or city you're tuning in from. I'm eager to see how far this grim narrative will reach. Now, let's go back to that fateful year when the millstones ground more than just corn and wheat. The morning mist still lingered over Copper Creek when young Timothy Phelps made a discovery that would expose the most horrific secret in Connecticut's industrial past. Millbrook was a town that embodied the hopeful spirit of New England in the 1850s. Nestled among the rolling hills of northwestern Connecticut, it had a population of nearly 800 souls. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and their families had forged a prosperous life from the rugged terrain and swift, flowing streams. Main Street ran alongside Copper Creek, adorned with neat clapboard houses whose gardens overflowed with hollyhocks and climbing roses in the summer. The Congregational Church, with its pristine white steeple, stood at the town's center, its bell sending out resonant notes across the valley every Sunday. The town took pride in its industry, 3 sawmills processing timber from the surrounding forests, 2 tanneries that permeated the air with the sharp scent of oak bark and leather, a blacksmith shop where hammer blows echoed from dawn till dusk, and most significantly, the Hartwell Brothers gristmill, which had been grinding grain for the surrounding communities since 1832. The flow of commerce mirrored the creek itself, with farmers arriving in wagons laden with wheat and corn, departing with sacks of flour that would become the daily bread for 3 counties. The mill, a formidable structure of timber and stone, was situated where Copper Creek made a sharp bend through a narrow gorge. Its enormous water wheel, 24 feet in diameter, turned with a steady rhythm that locals claimed you could set your watch by. The building itself rose 4 stories high, its weathered clapboard sides dark with age and moisture, its windows reflecting light like watchful eyes. On calm days, the sound of the grinding stones traveled for miles, a deep rumble that had become as much a part of the valley's soundscape as bird song or wind through the trees. Inside, the mill was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. Wooden gears the size of wagon wheels transferred power from the water wheel to the grinding stones. Leather belts connected to auxiliary equipment, grain cleaners, flour sifters, and bagging apparatus. The aroma of freshly ground wheat permeated everything, clinging to clothes and hair, imbuing anyone who worked there with the distinct scent of honest labor. The primary grinding stones, imported from France at considerable expense, were made of barstone, a type of quartz that retained its cutting edge far longer than local granite. Josiah and Elias Hartwell had inherited the mill from their father, old Solomon Hartwell, who had built it with his own hands and a loan from the Salem Bank. Solomon had been a pillar of the community, serving as a selectman for 15 years, a man who read his Bible daily and insisted his workers observe the Sabbath. His portrait still hung in the mill office, his stern eyes seemingly scrutinizing all who entered. While Solomon had been a God-fearing man who closed the mill on Sundays and donated generously to the Congregational Church, his sons were of a different ilk. Josiah, the elder at 43, was a giant of a man with hands like iron vises and eyes the color of wet slate. Standing 6 feet 3 inches in his stockings, he had to stoop to pass through most doorways in town. His black hair, now streaked with premature gray, was always meticulously combed back with pomade. He managed the business side, negotiating prices with a shrewdness that bordered on ruthlessness, meticulously managing accounts, and relentlessly collecting debts. Local farmers knew better than to delay payments. Josiah was known to seize entire harvests for debts as small as $5. Elias, 6 years younger, was the mechanical genius. Thin as a rail, with restless hands that were never still, he could make the mill run like silk, knowing every gear, shaft, and stone by touch alone. Where Josiah was unyielding, Elias was constantly in motion, murmuring to himself about gear ratios and grinding speeds, sketching mechanical improvements on any available surface. He had briefly studied at the Sheffield Scientific School before his father's death called him home, bringing back ideas about efficiency and mechanical advantage that he applied obsessively to the mill's operation. The brothers had never married. Married to the mill, folks would say, though never within earshot. Years ago there had been talk of Josiah courting the Waverley girl from Hartford, but nothing came of it. Some speculated she had taken one look at those cold, grey eyes and fled back to city society. Elias had never shown interest in anything that didn't have gears or couldn't grind grain. They lived in the house their father built, a Greek revival structure overlooking the mill from a small rise, its white columns now yellowed with neglect. The gardens their mother had tended were overgrown with brambles and wild saplings. They largely kept to themselves, emerging only for business or their weekly trip to Brewster's General Store for supplies. Josiah would stride down Main Street every Thursday at precisely 200 p.m., acknowledging greetings with the faintest nod, his heavy boots marking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. Elias rarely left the mill at all, preferring to send his brother on any necessary errands. When he did venture into town, he walked with quick, nervous steps, his eyes constantly darting, as if calculating the mechanical stress on every building's joints and foundations. The townspeople had grown to accept the brothers' eccentricities. After all, the Hartwell mill was the economic heart of Millbrook. It directly employed 12 men, millwrights, grain handlers, teamsters, and indirectly supported dozens more. Farmers relied on it to process their grain. Bakers depended on its consistent flour output, and merchants profited from the trade it brought to town. The mill's flour was renowned throughout the valley for its quality, fine, white, and consistent. Orders came from as far away as Providence and New York. The summer of 1854 had been favorable to Millbrook. The wheat harvest was the best in living memory, golden waves undulating across the hillsides like a vast inland sea. Corn stood tall in the fields, and the apple orchards promised a bumper crop. The 4th of July celebration had been particularly grand, with fireworks brought from Hartford and a brass band from Waterbury. Talk of progress was everywhere. The railway was expected to reach them by 1856, opening new markets for their grain and flour. The town meeting had approved funds for a new schoolhouse, and Dr. Elias Thornton from Boston was considering establishing a practice in town. Millbrook's social fabric was tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone else's business, from the mayor's gout to Widow Henderson's scandalous correspondence with a traveling salesman. The ladies' auxiliary met every Tuesday to sew quilts for the poor. The Temperance Society held monthly rallies, though their impact was limited given the popularity of Garrett's Tavern. Young people courted under watchful eyes at church socials and harvest dances. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting, tending, harvesting, and the long winters when the mill would run continuously, grinding the stored grain while snow piled deep against its walls. However, beneath this veneer of prosperity and progress, whispers of older things lingered. The oldest residents recalled stories their grandparents had told about the bend in Copper Creek, where the mill stood. The Mohegan Indians had avoided that spot, claiming the water flowed backward there on certain nights. There were tales of lights seen in the gorge during the new moon, and of sounds that were neither the creek nor the wind. Most dismissed these as superstition, remnants of a less enlightened age, but sometimes on foggy nights, when the mill wheel turned and the stones ground their endless meal, even the most rational citizens would quicken their pace when passing by. As autumn approached in 1854, with leaves beginning their slow transformation from green to gold and scarlet, something shifted in Millbrook. It began with strangers, always a noteworthy occurrence in a town where everyone knew each other's lineage back 3 generations. But these were not the usual peddlers or traveling minstrels. These were solitary figures, here one day and gone the next, leaving no trace but questions. And, as it would turn out, a terrible void. The first to disappear was a peddler named Jacob Morse, though no one realized it at the time. He had arrived in town on September 15th with his wagon full of tin goods and patent medicines, making his usual rounds. Mary Wadsworth, who ran the boarding house, remembered him specifically because he tried to sell her a tonic guaranteed to cure her husband's rheumatism. Said he was heading up to the Hartwell mill before dark. She would later tell the constable. Wanted to see if they needed any machinery oil. I warned him those brothers didn't take kindly to peddlers, but he just laughed. Said he'd sold to harder customers than country millers. Morse's wagon was discovered 3 days later, abandoned on the old logging road 2 miles north of town. His horse grazed peacefully nearby, still in its traces. The wagon was undisturbed, all his goods accounted for. Even the cash box hidden under the seat contained 17 in coins and bills. But Jacob Morse was gone. The only peculiar detail, according to Constable Rufus Baldwin, was the flour dust covering everything, as if someone had emptied a sack of freshly ground meal over the entire wagon. The second disappearance occurred just a week later. Thomas Griswold, a 22-year-old from the neighboring town of Copper Falls, had been courting Alice Putnam, the minister's daughter. On the evening of September 22nd, he had left the Putnam house just after 8:00 p.m., promising to return the following Sunday. The quickest route back to Copper Falls past the Hartwell mill. I begged him to take the main road. Alice would later sob to her father, but he said the moon was bright and he'd save half an hour by the creek path. Said he wasn't afraid of the dark like a child. Thomas never made it home. His family searched for 3 days before finding his hat caught in some brambles near the mill's tail race, the channel where the water flows after turning the wheel. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing but that hat and, strangely, more of that fine flour dust, almost like snow on the surrounding leaves. By the time the third person vanished, a traveling photographer named Clarence Hooker, who had been documenting local mills for a Hartford newspaper, people were beginning to whisper. The whispers escalated to worried murmurs when the fourth and fifth individuals disappeared on the same night. A married couple, the Shermans, returning from visiting relatives in New Haven. Constable Baldwin, a methodical man who had served in the Mexican War, began to discern a pattern. He spread out a map on his desk and marked each disappearance with a lead pencil. Everyone had last been seen on the roads near the Hartwell mill. Everyone had vanished between dusk and dawn, and at every scene where belongings were found, there was that cursed flour dust. On October 3rd, Baldwin decided to pay the Hartwell brothers a visit. The mill was operating when he arrived just after noon, the steady rumble of the stones vibrating through the ground. He found Josiah in the office, a cramped room that smelled of grain dust and old leather. The miller looked up from his ledgers, his slate, grey eyes showing no surprise at the constable's presence. "Afternoon, Rufus," Josiah said, his voice as flat as his expression. "Come about the missing folks, I expect." Baldwin nodded. 5 people gone in 3 weeks, Josiah, all of them last seen in this vicinity, dangerous roads hereabouts. Josiah replied, returning to his figures, especially after dark. Creeks running high this year. Man could slip, get swept away, end up in Long Island Sound before anyone noticed. Bodies would catch somewhere. Always do. Josiah's pencil paused for a moment. Not always. Currents tricky near the gorge. Baldwin studied the miller's face, searching for something. Guilt, fear, knowledge. He found only that blank, impassive stare. "Mind if I look around?" "Mill's a dangerous place for those who don't know it," Josiah said. "Wouldn't want the law getting hurt on my property. Elias is particular about strangers near his machinery. I'll be careful." Josiah shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just stay clear of the grinding floor when the stones are running." "And Rufus?" The constable turned back. "You might want to solve these disappearances quick. Bad for business, all this talk. People might start taking their grain elsewhere." Baldwin spent 2 hours searching the mill. He found nothing unusual: sacks of grain, barrels of flour, the massive millstones grinding away with their endless hunger. Elias watched him from the shadows, never speaking, those nervous hands constantly adjusting valves and levers. The younger Hartwell's eyes followed Baldwin's every move with an intensity that made the constable's skin crawl. But it wasn't until Baldwin was leaving that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The main grinding stones, massive wheels of French burstone, each weighing over a ton, were running empty, no grain feeding through the hopper above. Yet they ground on, stone against stone, producing that fine dust that coated everything. "Why are you running empty stones?" Baldwin asked Elias, who had materialized beside him like a ghost. The younger brother's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Cleaning," he said, his voice like rustling leaves. "Got to keep them sharp, got to keep them hungry." That night, unable to shake his unease, Baldwin stationed himself on the hill overlooking the mill. He had told his wife he was checking on the widow Davenport's reported prowler, but in truth, he wanted to watch the Hartwell mill after dark. What he saw made him question his own sanity. Just a reminder, if this story is giving you the creeps, please hit that like button. It really helps other mystery lovers find these tales. And drop a comment with your theory about what the Hartwell brothers were really doing in that mill. Now, let's return to that terrible night when Constable Baldwin witnessed something that would haunt him forever. The mill operated all night, which was not unusual during harvest season. What was unusual was the traffic. Baldwin counted 3 wagons approaching the mill between midnight and 300 a.m. They arrived without lanterns, moving through the darkness with practiced ease. Each wagon was heavily loaded, covered with canvas, and each left empty an hour later. But it was what happened at 300 a.m. that truly shook him. By late October, 37 souls had vanished from the roads around Millbrook. The town was gripped by a fear that transcended the rational. Farmers began traveling in groups, armed with rifles and shotguns. The stagecoach added an extra guard. Families barred their doors at sunset and kept lanterns burning all night. The Hartwell mill continued its ceaseless grinding. Reverend Ezra Putnam called for days of prayer and fasting. Some of the more superstitious folk began leaving offerings at the old Indian marker stone near Copper Creek. Corn cakes and tobacco, as their grandparents had done during the troubles of 1793. But mostly, people just stayed away from the mill road after dark. It was young Timothy Phelps who finally uncovered the truth, though he nearly paid for that knowledge with his life. Timothy was 16, the blacksmith's son, with more curiosity than sense. He had been sweet on Jenny Lockwood, whose family farm lay on the other side of Copper Creek from the mill. Despite his parents' strict prohibition, he had been sneaking out to see her, taking the long way around to avoid the mill road. On the night of October 28th, a thick fog rolled in from the sound, blanketing the valley in grey wool. Timothy, emboldened by the cover it provided, decided to take the shorter route past the mill. He reasoned that in such fog, even the Hartwell brothers wouldn't see him passing. He was wrong. The fog muffled sounds, transforming the world into a realm of shadows and whispers. Timothy could hear the mill wheel turning, that steady splash and creak, and the deep rumble of the grinding stones. But as he crept along the path, other sounds reached his ears, voices, low and urgent, and the scrape of something heavy being dragged across wood. Timothy crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the fog, he could see lamplight glowing from the mill's loading dock. Shadows moved against the light, the unmistakable silhouettes of the Hartwell brothers. But there was something else, something that made Timothy's mouth go dry as dust. They were unloading a wagon, but not grain sacks. The shapes were wrong, too long, too limp, wrapped in canvas. As Timothy watched, frozen in horror, one of the bundles slipped from Elias's grip. An arm fell free of the wrapping, pale in the lamplight, fingers stiff as winter branches. Timothy must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, because suddenly Josiah's head snapped up, those grey eyes scanning the fog. "Someone's watching?" the elder brother said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The fog's thick," Elias replied, but his nervous hands had stilled. "No one travels on a night like this. Someone is." Timothy didn't wait to hear more. He ran stumbling through the fog, brambles tearing at his clothes, expecting at any moment to feel Josiah's iron hands close around his throat. He ran until his lungs burned, until he collapsed in the doorway of his father's smithy, sobbing and retching. The story he gasped out to his father would have been dismissed as a nightmare had not Timothy's clothes been torn and muddy, his face scratched by branches. And in his trembling hand he clutched something he had snagged during his flight, a piece of canvas, stained with what looked terribly like dried blood. Samuel Phelps was a practical man, but he was also a father. He loaded his rifle, barred the door, and sat up all night with his terrified son. At first light, he sent Timothy to Constable Baldwin while he rode to Hartford to fetch the county sheriff. By noon, a posse of 20 men had assembled. They surrounded the mill just as Josiah was emerging for his weekly trip to the general store. The elder Hartwell surveyed the armed men with no more emotion than if they had been a flock of geese. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "to what do I owe this visit?" Sheriff Cornelius Wadsworth, a veteran lawman who had seen his share of violence, stepped forward. "Josiah Hartwell, you and your brother are under arrest on suspicion of murder." "Murder?" Josiah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Who am I supposed to have murdered?" "Well, start with the 37 people who've gone missing these past weeks." "Missing people aren't murdered people. Sheriff, show me a body." "We intend to," Wadsworth replied grimly, "starting with a search of your mill." For the first time, something flickered in Josiah's eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation. "You have a warrant?" "Don't need one. This many missing people. I have cause to search every building in the county." Josiah's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Elias won't like strangers touching his machinery. Then he'd better cooperate. What they found in the mill's lower levels defied comprehension. The grinding room seemed normal enough at first glance, the massive stones turning slowly, the air thick with grain dust. But Rufus Baldwin, remembering his earlier visit, checked the grain hopper. Empty, yet the stones ground on. "Stop the wheel," Sheriff Wadsworth ordered. Elias, who had been watching from the stairs with those nervous, darting eyes, shook his head. "Can't, won't. The stones must feed. Stop it or we'll break it." It was Josiah who finally nodded to his brother. With obvious reluctance, Elias threw the lever that disengaged the wheel. The mill shuddered to a stop, the sudden silence almost painful after the constant rumble. "Now," Wadsworth said, "raise the runner stone." The Hartwell brothers exchanged a look that sent chills down Baldwin's spine. "That stone weighs near 2 tons, Josiah said quietly. "Take special equipment to lift it. Then you'd better get started." It took 3 hours and all the mill's lifting gear to raise the massive runner stone. As it slowly rose on chains and pulleys, an ungodly smell began to fill the air, sweet and corrupt, like spoiled meat mixed with grain mash. Several men had to step outside to vomit. What lay beneath the stone was worse than anyone had imagined. The bedstone, that stationary lower wheel, had been modified. Instead of the normal pattern of grooves that channeled flour to the edges, deeper channels had been cut, all leading to a central hole. And caught in those channels, ground into the very stone itself, were fragments of things that should never have been in a gristmill bone: teeth, scraps of cloth, a woman's wedding ring crushed flat, a pocket watch, its face cracked, hands frozen at 3:17. "Dear God," someone whispered. But that wasn't the worst of it. The central hole led to a chute, and the chute led down into the mill's foundation. When they broke through the floor to follow it, they found a series of chambers carved from the bedrock itself. Some were empty, others Sheriff Wadsworth would later write in his official report that they found evidence of at least 43 individuals in those chambers. The bodies, what remained of them, had been systematically processed, the flesh stripped away, the bones sorted, some ground to powder in the stones above, others stacked like cordwood in the deepest chamber, and on the walls, carved in Elias's nervous hand, were tallies, names and dates going back not weeks or months, but years. The earliest date was 1834, 2 years after the brothers had inherited the mill. 20 years of murder. 20 years of grinding human bones into the flour that fed the surrounding communities. The arrest of the Hartwell brothers sent shock waves through Connecticut and beyond. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia carried the story, each more sensational than the last. The Millbrook cannibals, they called them, though there was no evidence the brothers had engaged in that particular horror. Under interrogation, the truth emerged in pieces, like a puzzle assembled from a nightmare. It had started, Josiah claimed, by accident. A drifter had tried to rob them in the winter of 1834, breaking into the mill office where they kept their strongbox. Elias had surprised the man, and in the struggle, the thief had fallen down the stairs to the grinding floor, breaking his neck. "We should have reported it," Josiah told Sheriff Wadsworth with that same flat effect. But times were hard. We owed money to the bank. Creditors were pressing. And Elias, he said. Why waste good meat? The younger brother had remembered something from their father's time, how during the terrible winter of 1816, the year without summer, people had ground anything they could into flour to survive: acorns, chestnuts, even dried fish. Protein was protein, Elias reasoned, and bones, when ground fine enough, added calcium to the flour, made it more nutritious. Just that once, Josiah insisted, to get through the winter, no one would know. The stones would grind anything to dust. But once they had crossed that line, there was no going back. The mill's flour became known for its quality: white as snow, fine as silk, with a richness that made bread rise higher and cakes more tender. Orders increased, profits soared. And the brothers found they needed more raw material. They became selective. Travelers, no one would miss: drifters, peddlers, foreigners heading west who wouldn't be expected anywhere specific. For 20 years, they had maintained their terrible harvest, taking just enough to supplement their regular milling, never enough to arouse suspicion. But this year, Josiah explained, his voice finally showing cracks, Elias got greedy, or maybe mad. He said the stones were hungry, always hungry, said we needed to feed them more. The acceleration of disappearances in 1854 was Elias's doing. He developed a taste for it, Josiah claimed, not for the killing itself, but for the mechanics of it, the efficiency, the way a human body could be reduced to its component parts, processed, utilized, nothing wasted. He kept journals, Josiah said, and indeed they found them 3 leather-bound volumes filled with Elias's cramped handwriting. Detailed notes on processing times, bone to flour ratios, optimal grinding speeds for different densities. The journals read like technical manuals, devoid of emotion or acknowledgement that the material had once been human. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from the financial ledgers. The brothers had kept meticulous records of their flour sales, and when investigators cross-referenced dates, they found that shipments of the special blend flour, supplemented with bone meal, had gone to bakeries and households throughout the valley. For 20 years, the people of Millbrook and surrounding towns had unknowingly consumed bread made from the remains of the missing. The trial of the Hartwell brothers became the most sensational legal proceeding in Connecticut history. The courthouse in Hartford overflowed with spectators, journalists, and curiosity seekers. Vendors sold Hartwell Mill souvenirs outside, miniature millstones, bags of flour, guaranteed pure, even photographs of the brothers in their cell. Josiah maintained his stoic demeanor throughout, answering questions in that same flat voice, showing emotion only when discussing the mill's mechanical operations. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the moral outrage, as if he couldn't understand why people were upset about what he saw as a practical solution to economic hardship. Elias, on the other hand, deteriorated rapidly in custody. Separated from his beloved machinery, his nervous energy turned inward. He would sit for hours, moving his hands as if adjusting invisible levers and gears, muttering about feed rates and stone alignment. By the time the trial began, he was deemed incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane in Middletown. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Timothy Phelps testified about what he had seen that foggy night. Constable Baldwin described his investigations and growing suspicions. A parade of relatives identified personal effects found in the mill's terrible chambers: rings, watches, buttons, scraps of clothing. But it was the testimony of Dr. Marcus Davenport, brought in from Yale Medical College, that truly horrified the jury. He had examined the remains found in the mill and confirmed not only their human origin, but also the systematic nature of their processing. This was not random violence, he stated. This was industrial murder. The bodies were processed with the same efficiency as grain, reduced to their useful components with mechanical precision. I have seen battlefield casualties, gentlemen. I have performed countless autopsies, but I have never seen human beings reduced to inventory. The defense, such as it was, relied on pleas of economic necessity and mental deficiency. Josiah's lawyer argued that the brothers had been driven to extremity by poverty, that their actions, while regrettable, were those of desperate men trying to save their family legacy. He pointed out that they had never killed for pleasure or passion, only for profit. It was a losing argument. On December 15, 1854, after just 3 hours of deliberation, The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. Josiah Hartwell was sentenced to hang. But the story didn't end with the verdict. In the weeks following the trial, strange events began to plague Millbrook. It started with the flour. Every household in the valley began to examine their flour stores with growing horror. Was this batch made before the arrests? How could they tell? Some families burned their entire pantries. Others attempted to return flour to merchants who refused it, having no way to verify its purity. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Bakeries closed. The grain market collapsed. Farmers couldn't sell their wheat at any price. The 3 remaining mills in the area saw their business vanish overnight. As rumors spread that the Hartwell Brothers' practices were an industry-wide secret, then came the illnesses, whether from psychological suggestion or some darker cause. People throughout the valley began reporting mysterious ailments, stomach pains, nightmares. A woman in Copper Falls swore she could taste blood, her morning bread. A child in Millbrook claimed his porridge contained tiny fragments of bone, though examination showed only ordinary oatmeal. Dr. Davenport was called back from Yale to investigate. He found no physical cause for the ailments, but noted the profound psychological trauma affecting the entire region. They have discovered they were unwitting cannibals. He wrote in his journal, "The horror of it has poisoned not just their bodies, but their minds." However, other incidents couldn't be explained by mass hysteria. The Hartwell Mill, sealed by court order pending demolition, began showing signs of activity. Neighbors reported lights moving through the windows at night. The water wheel, which had been locked in place, was found turning one morning, though the water gates remained closed. Most unsettling of all, people passing the mill claimed to hear the grinding stones running, that deep rumble that had once been the heartbeat of the town. Constable Baldwin, now promoted to sheriff after Wadsworth's retirement, the old lawman claimed the case had aged him 10 years, investigated these reports personally. He found no sign of human intrusion, but he did find something that chilled him to the bone: fresh flour dust on the grinding room floor, as if the stones had been running just moments before. "Impossible," he muttered, checking the massive runner stone. It remained locked in its raised position, chains taut, exactly as it had been left after the investigation. Yet the flour dust was there, fine as ever, coating every surface. The town council, desperate to move past the horror, voted to demolish the mill immediately rather than wait for spring as planned. But when the work crew arrived on a cold January morning, they made a horrifying discovery. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Elias Hartwell's return. Elias Hartwell was there. The younger brother had escaped from the asylum 3 days earlier, though authorities hadn't yet connected that escape to Millbrook. How he'd traveled 50 miles in winter, barefoot and wearing only his asylum clothes, no one could explain. But there he was, standing before the grinding stones, his nervous hands moving over the machinery with loving familiarity. "Can't stop," he said when Sheriff Baldwin approached, gun drawn. "The stones are hungry, always hungry. Father knew, Josiah knew, you'll know, too." Elias had somehow started the mill despite the water gates being closed, despite the wheel being locked. The stones were grinding, producing that fine dust that filled the air like fog. But grinding what? The hoppers were empty, had been empty since the arrests. "Elias," Baldwin said carefully, "step away from the stones." The younger Hartwell brother turned, and Baldwin saw that whatever sanity had remained to him was gone. His eyes were bright with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding, his hands raw from working the frozen controls. "Do you know what we discovered, Sheriff?" Elias asked conversationally. "The stones remember every grain, every kernel, every bone. They remember the taste, and once they've tasted, they hunger for more." He laughed then, a sound like grinding gears. 20 years we fed them. You think they'll stop now? You think you can starve stones that have drunk so deep? Baldwin would later report that what happened next defied rational explanation. Elias turned back to the controls, and the grinding stones began to speed up, faster and faster, until the entire building shook with their fury. Dust filled the air so thick it was impossible to see or breathe. There was a sound like thunder, a flash of something that might have been lightning, but couldn't have been. Not inside a building. When the dust cleared, Elias was gone, not escaped, gone. The only sign of him was a scatter of blood on the bedstone and his asylum clothes, shredded as if they'd been pulled through the grinding mechanism. But that was impossible. The gap between the stones was barely half an inch. No human body could fit through that space. Baldwin ordered the mill sealed again, this time with iron bars across every entrance and guards posted round the clock. But the damage was done. Word of Ilias's impossible disappearance spread, adding supernatural terror to the human horror that already gripped the valley. Josiah's final revelation, the execution of Josiah Hartwell, was set for January 20th, 1855. As the date approached, Millbrook descended into a kind of collective madness. The very air seemed to thicken with dread, as if the coming event cast shadows backward through time. Strange incidents multiplied with each passing day. Animals refused to drink from Copper Creek, backing away with rolling eyes and trembling flanks. Every mill in the county began experiencing mechanical failures, stones cracking without cause, wheels seizing mid-turn, gears stripping their teeth as if chewing on invisible bones. Children throughout the valley spoke of the same nightmare. They were grains of wheat tumbling helplessly toward massive stones that ground with the sound of laughter. In Hartford, Josiah Hartwell sat in his cell with the same unnatural calm he displayed throughout his trial. The stone walls switted in the January cold, and frost formed on the iron bars, but Josiah seemed immune to the temperature. He spent his days drawing mechanical diagrams on the walls with a piece of charcoal, designing improvements to mill efficiency, with the same dispassion he'd shown when discussing his victims. The drawings were remarkably detailed, gear ratios calculated to the third decimal, stress points identified and reinforced, new methods for increasing grinding speed without sacrificing fineness. Guards reported that he never slept. They would check on him at all hours and find him sitting on his narrow cot, staring at his diagrams or simply gazing at something beyond the walls that only he could see. He ate mechanically, chewing each bite exactly 20 times before swallowing, as if consumption itself was merely another process to be optimized. When Reverend Putnam visited to offer spiritual comfort, Josiah listened politely, his gray eyes never leaving the minister's face. But when Putnam paused in his scripture reading, Josiah's first question was whether the Reverend knew the optimal moisture content for wheat storage. 14%, he said when Putnam couldn't answer. Below that, the grain becomes brittle. Above it molds. Everything has its perfect state for processing, Reverend. Everything. The guards began to dread their shifts. There was something deeply unsettling about Josiah's presence, a wrongness that went beyond his crimes. It was as if he existed slightly out of phase with the rest of humanity, operating according to laws and logic that no one else could perceive. Even hardened criminals in neighboring cells complained of nightmares when Josiah was near. 3 days before the execution, everything changed. Sheriff Baldwin was doing his evening rounds when he heard something unprecedented: Josiah Hartwell laughing. Not the mad cackle of his brother, but deep, genuine laughter that seemed to come from some vast space within him. It was the laughter of a man who has finally understood a cosmic joke that no one else can see. "Sheriff," Josiah called out, his voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. "Come here. I need to tell you something important." Baldwin approached warily. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cell walls, making Josiah's mechanical drawings seem to move and shift. In that uncertain light, Josiah's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something far worse. "You think you understand," Josiah said, leaning forward until his face nearly touched the bars. His breath misted in the cold air, and Baldwin noticed it smelled faintly of flour. Impossible, as the jail food contained only cornmeal mush and hard bread. "You think this was about money, about desperation. You think we were monsters who killed for profit, don't you?" Baldwin's hand instinctively moved to his pistol. Josiah's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfect, as if they'd been ground smooth. "Why, never killed anyone, Sheriff, not once. Oh, we processed them, ground them, sold them, but kill them? No, that was never necessary. Baldwin felt ice crystallize in his veins. "What are you saying? The mill, Sheriff. The mill's been there longer than Millbrook, longer than Connecticut, longer than memory." Josiah's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the corridor. The Indians knew. They called it the place where the earth eats. Why do you think they avoided that bend in the creek? My father knew too, though he fought it. Fought it for 20 years before it finally claimed him. "You're insane." Baldwin's voice cracked slightly. "Am I? Then explain Elias. Explain how he traveled 50 miles barefoot in winter. Explain the stones running without power. Explain why every mill in the valley is failing now." Josiah sat back, his chains rattling with a sound like grinding gears. "You think you've stopped it by arresting us, but the mill's still there, still hungry. And hunger, Sheriff, hunger always finds a way to feed." Josiah leaned forward again, and Baldwin saw that the man's pupils had dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. "Do you want to know the real secret, Sheriff? Why the flour was so fine, so white, so perfect?" Baldwin found himself nodding despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "The stones don't just grind grain, Sheriff. They grind everything, past and present, memory and flesh, hope and bone. They take what is and reduce it to what can be used. And once you've fed them long enough, once you've given them a taste for something richer than wheat." Josiah's chains rattled again as he spread his hands. "They teach you things, show you the patterns hidden in the grinding, the mathematics of reduction, the beauty of complete utilization." "The beauty." Baldwin's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh yes, there's beauty in efficiency, Sheriff. In waste becoming resource, in the transformation of the complex to the simple. Every person who went into those stones, they became part of something larger. Their calcium strengthened bones throughout the valley. Their proteins nourished children. Their iron enriched blood. They didn't die, Sheriff. They were transformed, processed, utilized. Is that not a kind of immortality?" Baldwin stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door. Josiah's laughter followed him, not loud, but somehow penetrating, like the sound of stones grinding in the distance. The aftermath and enduring hunger that night, Baldwin couldn't bring himself to go home. Instead, he sat in his office, poring over old records by candlelight. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew. The site of the Hartwell mill appeared in document after document, always associated with disappearances, tragedies, and strange occurrences. In 1657, an entire Puritan family, the Weatherbys, had vanished from their farm near that bend in the creek. Their cabin was found intact, dinner still on the table, but of the family, parents and 4 children, there was no trace. In 1691, Odier Morse had built the first mill on that spot. Within a year, he and his entire family had disappeared. The mill was found running, grinding nothing, the stones worn smooth as glass. In 1703, William Brewster had claimed the land. He lasted just 1 winter before abandoning the property, telling anyone who would listen that the creek whispered to him at night in voices that weren't quite human. He died 3 months later, speaking of stones that ground in his dreams. Even Solomon Hartwell's death in 1832 took on new significance. The official record stated he'd been found at the base of the wheel, his body crushed. But a margin note in the coroner's report, nearly faded with age, mentioned something else. Body showed signs of partial processing, flesh abraded in patterns consistent with grinding action. How this occurred with the mill wheel stationary remains unexplained. The morning of January 20th dawned grey and bitterly cold. Ice crystals hung in the air like suspended grief, and the sun struggled to penetrate clouds that seemed heavy with more than snow. The gallows had been erected in the Hartford jail, the fresh pine lumber standing out starkly against the weathered stone walls. Despite the early hour and freezing weather, a crowd of over 300 had gathered. Some came for justice, some for spectacle, and some perhaps hoping that Josiah's death would end the curse that seemed to have fallen over the valley. The crowd was unusually quiet. Where executions typically drew raucous mobs calling for blood, this gathering had the hushed quality of a funeral or a ritual. People stamped their feet against the cold and spoke in whispers, their breath forming ghosts in the frigid air. Many clutched religious symbols, crosses, holy water, prayer beads. Others carried older protections, iron horseshoes, rowan branches, salt in small leather pouches. At precisely 7:45 a.m., the prison doors opened. Josiah Hartwell emerged between two guards, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. He had changed. Where before he'd been merely large, he now seemed vast, as if he'd expanded to fill more space than his body should occupy. His prison clothes hung on him like grain sacks, and his bare feet, he'd refused shoes, left prints in the frost that steamed as if burning. He walked to the gallows with the same steady gait he'd used to walk his mill, each step deliberate and measured. The crowd parted before him like wheat before a scythe. Some later swore they heard the sound of grinding stones with each footfall, though that was surely impossible. On the scaffold, the hangman, brought specially from Boston, waited with professional calm, though witnesses noticed his hands trembling as Josiah approached. The prisoner had to duck to fit under the crossbeam, and when he stood on the trap, the new wood groaned ominously. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Josiah looked out over the crowd, his grey eyes sweeping across the assembled faces like a miller inspecting grain. When he spoke, his voice carried to the farthest edges of the yard without him raising it. "You think this ends with me," he said. "You think the hunger dies when the feeder is gone. But I tell you now, the stones remember every grain, every bone, every life that passed through them. They remember and they hunger, and they will call to others as they called to us." He paused, and in that silence everyone present heard it, a distant rumbling like thunder underground or massive stones turning. "The mill will stand empty," Josiah continued, "but not still, never still. And one day, when the hunger grows too great, when the stones can no longer bear their emptiness, someone will come. Someone will always come, because efficiency calls to those who can hear it. Utilization sings to those who understand. And the grinding." He smiled then, a terrible expression that transformed his face into something inhuman. "The grinding never ends." The hangman moved to place the hood over Josiah's head, but the condemned man shook his head. "No, let them see. Let them remember. Let them know what watches and waits and hungers in the dark." At precisely 80,000 a.m., the trap was sprung. Josiah Hartwell dropped, the rope snapping taut with a sound like breaking stone. But as his body fell, every mill in the valley, every single one from Hartford to the Massachusetts border, suddenly rode to life. In Colchester, the old Browning Mill's wheel began turning, though the sluice gates were frozen solid. In Warehouse Point, millstones that had been separated for cleaning slammed together and began grinding. In dozens of towns, the sound rose, a grinding, hungry roar that sent people fleeing from their homes, hands pressed to their ears. At the abandoned Hartwell Mill, the guards later reported, the building shook as if in an earthquake. The great wheel, despite being chained, spun so fast it threw spray 100 feet into the air, the frozen creek somehow providing impossible torrents of water. The sound from inside was described by one guard as, like the earth itself was screaming, and by another as, the sound of 1,000 mouths chewing. Windows shattered outward in perfect synchronization. The massive doors, barred and bolted, burst open as if blown by some internal pressure. And from the grinding room came a light, not the warm glow of fire, but something cold and pale like moonlight filtered through flour dust. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. At the exact moment the prison clock struck 8:01 a.m., marking the minute of Josiah's death, every mill fell silent. Every wheel stopped, every stone stilled. An unnatural quiet settled over the valley, as if the very air was holding its breath. At the gallows, Josiah's body hung motionless, but witnesses swore they saw something impossible in those final seconds. As the mills fell silent, his corpse seemed to collapse inward, as if something essential had been withdrawn. When they cut him down, the body weighed barely half what it should have, and the undertaker reported that the flesh had a strange granular texture, as if it had been partially ground. But the most disturbing discovery came that afternoon when Sheriff Baldwin returned to check on the Hartwell Mill. The guards were gone, not dead, simply vanished, their rifles left leaning against the walls, their footprints ending abruptly at the threshold. Inside, the mill was immaculate. Every surface had been cleaned, every piece of machinery oiled and adjusted. The grinding stones, those massive wheels that had processed so much horror, were polished to a mirror finish, and carved into the wooden floor of the grinding room in letters 3 feet high was a single word, Ephron Gry. Baldwin ordered the mill sealed again, this time with every entrance bricked up solid. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the January wind, that it wouldn't matter. The mill had tasted something richer than grain, and that taste would linger. The stones would remember, and eventually, inevitably, someone would come to feed them again. Because Josiah had been right about one thing: hunger always finds a way. As Baldwin stood in that empty, too-clean grinding room, he heard something that made him flee and never return. From deep beneath the floor, deeper than the basements, deeper than should have been possible, came a sound like massive stones turning, grinding, waiting, always waiting. A centuries-old evil in the days that followed Josiah's execution. Investigators made one final terrible discovery at the Hartwell mill. Hidden beneath the foundation, deeper than the chambers where bodies had been found, was a sub-basement that predated the mill itself. The walls were not colonial construction, but something far older. Fitted stones covered in symbols that Dr. Davenport, consulted for his archaeological knowledge, identified as pre-Columbian. In the center of this ancient chamber was a stone, not a millstone, but something that resembled one, carved from a single piece of granite, covered in worn symbols with grooves that spiraled inward to a central hole that seemed to descend forever into darkness. Around it were offerings, corn, tobacco, and yes, bones, some animal, some not. This is why they built here, Davenport wrote in his final report. The Hartwells didn't bring evil to this place. They were drawn to it, called to it. The mill was just a modern expression of something far older, a hunger that has existed in this spot for centuries, perhaps millennia. The town council, faced with this discovery, made a decision that would be debated for generations. Rather than demolish the mill and risk releasing whatever dwelt beneath it, they sealed it. Every entrance was bricked up. The wheel was removed and destroyed. The millstones were broken with sledgehammers, and the pieces scattered in the deepest parts of Long Island Sound. The ancient chamber was filled with cement, tons of it, pumped in until the contractors swore they could pump no more. Then they diverted Copper Creek itself, changing its course so that it no longer flowed past the mill. The building, robbed of its water power, stood like a tombstone slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Millbrook never recovered. Within 5 years, most of the population had moved away, unable to live with the memories and the shame. The railway that was to bring prosperity bypassed the town entirely. By 1870, Millbrook was just a name on old maps, its houses empty, its remaining mills silent. But the stories persisted. Travelers passing through the valley reported strange sounds on foggy nights, like grinding stones, distant but distinct. Hunters avoided the area where the mill stood, claiming their dogs would whine and refuse to track near the old creek bed. And every few years, someone would disappear on the old roads, leaving behind only their belongings and a fine dusting of what might have been flour. Timothy Phelps, the boy whose discovery had unveiled the horror, lived to be 87. On his deathbed in 1923, he called his grandson to his side. "Stay away from mills, boy," he whispered. "Stay away from old stones and old hungers. Some things, once they get a taste, never stop being hungry." The Hartwells knew that. Lord help them. They knew, and they fed it anyway. Fed it until it owned them body and soul. He died clutching a handful of wheat kernels, as if even in death he needed to remember the difference between grain and what else might be ground to flour. The Hartwell mill still stands, though few know its location now. The forest has reclaimed it, trees growing through its windows, vines covering its walls. Copper Creek found its way back despite human intervention, flowing once again past those sealed foundations. And sometimes, locals say, on nights when the fog rolls in thick from the sound, you can hear it, the distant rumble of stones grinding, always grinding. In 1954, exactly 100 years after the Hartwell Brothers' arrest, a developer from New York bought the land, intending to clear it for suburban homes. The bulldozer operator who first approached the mill reported that his machine died just 50 feet from the building. Every piece of equipment they brought suffered the same fate: mechanical failure within sight of those vine-covered walls. The project was abandoned. The land was eventually donated to the state as a nature preserve, with the stipulation that the mill never be disturbed. Official records list it as a historical structure unsafe for public access. The few historians who know its true history prefer it that way because some hungers, once awakened, never truly sleep. They just wait, patient as stone, for someone foolish enough to feed them again. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often human beings, driven by greed and circumstance to commit unthinkable acts. Or perhaps it shows us that some places are marked by an evil older than memory, drawing the susceptible into its service. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Remember, sometimes the things we fear in the dark are nothing compared to what humans are capable of in the light of day. See you in the next video.